Do you want to start your campaign on the correct foot? You need a session 0. Do you want some tips and tricks on how to run one? We're starting right now. If this is your first visit and you want tips and tricks to make your role-playing games a little bit more awesome, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you can stay in the know. How many times have you started a campaign or been part of a campaign that went nowhere or wound down because people lost interest? It might be because your GM failed to engage them, and I know where you can get some advice about that. But it might be because you had differing expectations, and one great way to get everyone on the same page is by having a Session 0. Session 0 is the first pseudo-session for a long-form campaign, and one where we set a lot of the tone for what comes next. I'm going to assume you've already done a pitch of some sort, so the groundwork is already laid, but if not, you're going to want to do that here. What are your must-haves for Session 0s? Please drop them in the comments below so we can all learn. This discussion is broken into 4 chunks, each of which is vitally important to getting your campaign started. So let's get going. Part 1. Social Expectations and Logistics. At their very core, tabletop role-playing games are social engagements, and we should talk about some of the social contracts we expect as GMs and players. For instance, how do you feel about side conversations? I find them terribly distracting because not all of my players have had indoor voices. I try to limit them because, in addition to not wanting the distraction, I want to hear all the fun stuff they're talking about, but you might have different preferences. What about interrupting other players? Some folks get really upset about this, even in non-gaming contexts. This is doubly bad if they're in the middle of a dramatic scene. Many players have no idea how to frame a scene, but interrupting your pals is just bad manners. You know your players better than I do, so call it out if you think you have to. What are your requirements for player participation? Players often get distracted, especially in today's world of instant gratification and ubiquitous internet. In the bad old days when I started, it was stacking dice and reading through manuals and shoving Cheetos in our face. What happens to a player character when the player is absent? Do they fade into the background? Do we need to find an excuse for why they're not there? Are they played by another player? And if so, are they just as likely to die in combat as the other player characters? What if the party wipes? What then? What kind of commitment do you expect for your game? And how long do we expect the campaign to go? Some games require really high attendance, and you really want your players to know that so they can plan for it. I have screwed this up more times than I care to admit, and I can say from personal experience that it super sucks to have to kill a campaign because folks couldn't regularly show. If you speak openly with your players about your expectations, most folks will do their best to avoid letting everyone down. Part 2. Expectations for the game. Just like social expectations, you should talk about what you want for the game too, both for you and the other players at the table. For instance, how would you rate the campaign if it were a movie? How do you feel about adult themes, graphic violence, psychological horror? Are you cool with fading into black when things get sketchy, or do you need to have a safe word of some kind? What happens when a player character dies? Do we roll a new character, or is resurrection a real possibility? It isn't in my world. I would take it for granted that we would roll a new character, but I come from a tradition where this is expected. Not everyone does. Are we playing tactically with maps and minis, or are we doing theater of the mind where it's all descriptions? If your players signed up for one and got the other, they may be disappointed. Do we need to have characters that get along? Do you allow PvP? Do characters have to be invested in the campaign hooks, or can they be reticent lone wolf types? You know the type. Are there any rules that we're explicitly not using from the game, like feats or flanking in 5th edition? And probably more importantly, are we house ruling anything? How much narrative authority do the players have? Is this an actor stance only game, or are author and director stances okay too? And if you need a reminder of what stances are, blam, I got you covered. What kind of game is this anyway? Are we a high-flying fantasy like Critical Role? A dark and gritty meat grinder like the West Marches? A comedic romp through a sci-fi setting like Nebula Jazz? Or something else entirely? Getting these details out now could prevent a lot of hard feelings later. While some of these things might be uncomfortable to talk about, it is far better to have them out on the table before we get into trouble at the table. Part 3. Role Characters. If you want your players to roll characters before Session 0, that's okay. But many games like Dungeon World want you to roll characters at your first session. That would be now. If there are restrictions on race or class or requirements for either, this is a great time to talk about them. For example, do we need to have a balanced party? Most games with combat want some kind of healing. How in-depth we expect character backgrounds to be, because I don't want to write a tome if there's no expectation that that stuff gets worked in the game somehow. Let's work through traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws if we're in 5th edition, and bonus points if we also talk about player character beliefs. Let's work through some shared concepts too while we're at it. Doing this stuff as a group can really crank up the creativity. Bonds from Dungeon World can flow very naturally from this kind of discussion. And if you're not using bonds from Dungeon World, you should consider it. I like talking about potential themes as a group in Session 0, given the player character's beliefs, even if we're not rolling characters. Sometimes we even play it backwards, where we talk about the themes first and then build beliefs from them. For example, in my fantasy campaign, we knew they'd be part of a mercenary company on a mission in a dangerous city. We required player characters to have a belief stating why they stay with the company. Establishing this early made a lot of problems go away, which I like. As GMs and teams, we have enough work to do as it is. If this is more of a sandbox game, I love taking this opportunity to let players drop into director stance. I want them to help me build part of the world that their player characters are from, because all of us are more creative than, yeah, you get it. Validate and acknowledge your players' creativity. This is your first chance to be their biggest fan. Part 4. Play or not. I'm going to guess that you went through an awful lot of trouble to get folks together. I say play if you've got the time. As much fun as this other stuff might be, let's actually get into it a bit. And if you do, here are my recommendations. Try to show off the mechanics of the game, especially if folks are new to it. Definitely go through all the crunchy stuff like combat, but don't forget the other stuff like social skills and saving throws. This is especially true if you've house ruled anything. Every once in a while, this will set the tone for things to come. The orc bartender/spy master Meat in my fantasy campaign started as a player character. His opening act in Session 0 was to fling a mug full of koba down the polished bar top, requiring a pair of dex checks. Even though the player can't join us for shenaniganry any longer, we keep up the tradition in every session. Without a Session 0, my campaign would have been a little bit less awesome. If you are playing in Session 0, this is your first chance to set the stage for things to come. Try to introduce important characters if you can, especially the named ones. And note that you don't have to show them directly to introduce them, but that is a different video. Try to introduce the central tensions in as much as you understand them, and any factions or fronts that might be around. Try to telegraph as much of that stuff as you can to set up for awesome later. Most importantly, show them what's cool about your setting. Show them what's cool about your game. Let's uncork the imagination of all the folks at the table and leave them wanting more. I love Session 0. It represents all of the awe, wonder, and anticipation that makes our hobby great, and I hope that something in here will help your Session 0 be a little bit more awesome. I will drop a link in the doobly-doo to a Reddit post with an extremely complete list of topics that you might consider. For tips and tricks like these to improve your role-playing games, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you can stay in the know. Thanks a bunch for watching, and I'll see you on Sunday.